The Holocaust was one of the most horrific events in human history, a state-sponsored campaign of genocide orchestrated by Nazi Germany that systematically murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others considered undesirable by Adolf Hitler's regime. Yet despite the overwhelming mountain of evidence, there have always been voices attempting to deny, minimize, or distort the truth. Holocaust denial is not a legitimate historical debate but rather a malicious attempt to rewrite history, fueled by anti-Semitism, political agendas, and a desire to rehabilitate extremist ideologies. When confronted with the claim that the Holocaust was a hoax, one must understand that the very suggestion is an assault not only on the memory of the victims but on truth itself. It is critical to firmly debunk these lies and demonstrate why the Holocaust was tragically real, why denial persists, and why it must never be allowed to succeed. The evidence for the Holocaust is overwhelming. It exists in thousands of photographs, films, government documents, survivor testimonies, perpetrator confessions, physical remains of concentration camps, and even in the meticulous Nazi records themselves. The Nazis were compulsive record keepers. They documented transports of Jews in train schedules, listed deportations, recorded executions, and filed reports about the operation of gas chambers and crematoria. At Auschwitz, one of the most infamous death camps, architectural blueprints show the construction of gas chambers and crematoria, designed specifically for mass killing. There are invoices for Zyklon B gas ordered in quantities that far exceeded what would have been required for disinfection alone. At Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, though the Nazis tried to destroy the evidence before retreating, mass graves and remnants of cremation pits still exist. Even without documents, the eyewitness testimony alone would be impossible to dismiss. Tens of thousands of survivors have described, often in heart-wrenching detail, the horrors they endured. From ghettos where starvation was used as a weapon, to cattle cars transporting people in suffocating conditions, to the separation of families upon arrival at extermination camps, their memories align with one another and with the evidence left behind. Survivors described the selection process at Auschwitz, where Nazi doctors like Joseph Mengele decided who would be sent to forced labor and who would go directly to the gas chambers. They told of the smell of burning flesh from crematoria that filled the air, of piles of shoes and clothing stripped from the murdered, of experiments performed on prisoners, and of the skeletal figures left after years of starvation and abuse. The fact that survivors' accounts are consistent across time and geography strengthens the truth beyond any reasonable doubt. Holocaust denial relies on twisting details, exploiting gaps in evidence, or making outlandish claims that crumble under scrutiny. One common argument is that the number of Jewish victims has been exaggerated, with deniers suggesting that far fewer died. Yet census data before and after the war, combined with Nazi documents, clearly shows the loss of millions of Jews across Europe. Communities that had thrived for centuries were annihilated, synagogues destroyed, cemeteries abandoned, and entire populations erased. Countries like Poland lost over 90% of their Jewish citizens. The absence of these communities is itself undeniable proof of the genocide. Another denial tactic is to claim that gas chambers never existed or were used only for delousing. This ignores direct evidence. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the remains of gas chambers still exist, alongside Zyklon B residue in the walls. Survivors, perpetrators, and liberating soldiers all testified to their use. SS officers at Nuremberg admitted to overseeing gassings. Photographs smuggled out of Auschwitz show prisoners being led into chambers and bodies being burned. Allied forces who liberated camps like Bergen-Belsen and Dachau recorded what they saw in photographs and film reels that shocked the world. The visual documentation of piles of emaciated corpses, survivors barely clinging to life, and the machinery of mass murder cannot be dismissed. Some deniers argue that the Holocaust was fabricated as propaganda after the war to justify the creation of Israel. This argument is not only false but deeply insulting. The liberation of camps occurred before the establishment of Israel in 1948, and Allied soldiers were horrified by what they saw without any political agenda beyond documenting the truth. The Nuremberg trials, held immediately after the war, relied on Nazi records and testimonies rather than fabricated evidence. Moreover, Jewish survivors had little political power at the time, and many were left wandering Europe in displaced persons camps, struggling to rebuild their shattered lives. The notion of a global conspiracy to invent a genocide defies logic and reality. It is also important to note that Holocaust denial often emerges not from genuine skepticism but from hatred. Antisemitism lies at its core. By claiming the Holocaust was a hoax, Deniers attempt to portray Jews as liars, manipulators, and conspirators who fabricated suffering for personal or political gain. This repackages centuries-old anti-Semitic tropes in a modern form, continuing the prejudice that fueled the Holocaust itself. Denial is therefore not a historical position but a political and ideological weapon, intended to undermine Jewish identity, erase Jewish suffering, and normalize extremist ideologies. The damage of denial is not limited to the Jewish community. Holocaust denial undermines truth in general. If overwhelming evidence of the Holocaust can be dismissed as fake, then any atrocity can be denied. This erodes the foundation of history and weakens society's ability to confront past crimes or prevent future ones. For survivors and their descendants, denial is particularly painful. To live through unimaginable suffering only to be told later that it never happened is an act of cruelty that re-traumatizes victims and insults the memory of those who did not survive. Scholars and educators have worked tirelessly to combat denial with facts. Holocaust museums across the world preserve artifacts, testimonies, and records. Institutions like Yad Vashem in Israel and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. exist to safeguard memory. Digital archives now make millions of documents and testimonies accessible to the public. These resources leave no room for doubt, yet they must continually be defended because denial persists, often spreading through online platforms where misinformation thrives. In recent decades, denial has taken on new forms. Instead of outright claiming the Holocaust never happened, some revisionists seek to minimize its scale, suggest it was no different from other wartime tragedies, or place equal blame on the victims. These softer forms of denial are equally dangerous because they normalize the erosion of truth. By claiming that the Holocaust was merely one tragedy among many, Deniers strip it of its specific historical reality as a systematic genocide driven by racial ideology. While millions of civilians certainly suffered in World War II, only the Jews, along with Roma, disabled people, and others targeted by Nazi racial policy, were singled out for total annihilation. That uniqueness must never be blurred or diminished. The fight against denial also requires understanding why people are drawn to it. For some, it is ignorance, a lack of education about the Holocaust, particularly as time distances us from the events. For others, it is ideology, a refusal to accept historical truth because it clashes with their political beliefs. Extremist groups embrace denial as a way to rehabilitate fascism and rehabilitate Hitler's image. Conspiracy theorists use denial to reinforce worldviews that see Jews as a secret power manipulating global events. Understanding these motivations helps in crafting strategies to combat denial, but it also demonstrates why denial is not about truth but about power and prejudice. There is a moral responsibility on all societies to remember and teach the Holocaust honestly. The phrase, "never again," emerged after the war as both a promise and a warning. Remembering the Holocaust is not only about honoring the dead but about safeguarding humanity from future atrocities. Genocide did not end in 1945. Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and other tragedies show that the seeds of hate can still grow. Denial of the Holocaust weakens the ability to respond to such threats by teaching people that even well-documented genocides can be dismissed. Defending the truth of the Holocaust is therefore essential for global human rights. As survivors age and pass away, denialists hope that living memory will vanish and their lies will flourish. That makes the preservation of testimony all the more urgent. Projects that record survivors, stories on video, hologram, and digital platforms ensure that future generations can hear directly from those who endured the camps. The words of survivors such as Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, and countless others are living proof against denial. Their testimonies carry the weight of lived reality that no amount of lies can erase. Holocaust denial is not only wrong but dangerous. It seeks to erase a crime against humanity, dishonor the dead, insult the survivors, and perpetuate hatred. The Holocaust was not a hoax. It was a meticulously planned genocide that murdered millions and left an indelible scar on human history. The evidence is irrefutable. To say otherwise is to embrace ignorance and malice. The responsibility of those who live today is to defend truth against lies, to remember those who perished, and to ensure that the world never forgets. To combat denial is not simply to defend Jewish history, it is to defend humanity's ability to face its darkest past honestly and to build a more just future. The evidence proving the Holocaust occurred is immense, detailed, and undeniable. Historians and researchers have uncovered millions of documents, photographs, and Nazi government records that describe in chilling clarity the policies of extermination. Deportation lists, train schedules, memos about gas chambers, invoices for Zyklon B, and architectural blueprints of crematoria were not fabricated after the war but created by the Nazis themselves during their operations. Photographs taken both by perpetrators and liberators show the inhumane conditions, piles of corpses, and starved survivors. These records, combined with wartime radio broadcasts, diaries, and confiscated propaganda, provide overwhelming evidence that the Holocaust was a systematic, state-sponsored campaign of genocide that cannot be dismissed or distorted by deniers. Survivor testimonies remain some of the most powerful evidence of what occurred. Tens of thousands of survivors provided first-hand accounts of ghettos, deportations, selections, forced labor, and extermination. Their voices echo the truth of their lived reality, describing the unbearable hunger, separation of families, cruelty of guards, and horrors of mass killings. Testimonies align across different locations and times, painting a consistent picture of systemic brutality. Elie Wiesel wrote vividly about his experiences in Auschwitz, Primo Levi described survival in the camps, and countless others offered oral histories preserved in archives worldwide. The detail and emotional depth in these testimonies, corroborated by material evidence, leave no room for claims of fabrication. Each story is a thread in the vast fabric of truth that forms the history of the Holocaust. Perpetrator confessions also eliminate any doubt about the Holocaust's reality. During the Nuremberg trials and subsequent war crime prosecutions, high-ranking Nazi officials admitted to overseeing mass executions, operating extermination camps, and implementing the final solution. Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz, gave detailed accounts of how gas chambers were used and how millions were murdered under his supervision. Adolf Eichmann, who organized deportations, openly described his role during his trial in Jerusalem. These confessions were not coerced inventions but verifiable with documentation and witness accounts. When those responsible for the crimes themselves acknowledge them, it underscores the undeniable reality of genocide and debunks denial claims entirely. The physical remains of concentration and extermination camps stand as concrete testimony. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Majdanek, Belzec, Sobibor, and Chelmno are sites where millions perished, and their remains, gas chambers, crematoria ruins, barracks, watchtowers, barbed wire fences, still exist. Archaeological investigations have uncovered mass graves, personal belongings, and remnants of cremation pits, confirming large-scale killings. At Majdanek, a mountain of human ashes and bones still remains as evidence. The Nazis attempted to destroy many camps to cover their crimes, but their efforts were incomplete, leaving behind undeniable physical evidence. These sites, preserved as memorials, allow present and future generations to witness the remains of the machinery of genocide, disproving any claim that the Holocaust was fabricated. The use of gas chambers and Zyklon B in exterminations is supported by documents, testimonies, and physical evidence. Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide, was ordered in massive quantities far exceeding needs for disinfection. Survivors testified about the process of being herded into chambers disguised as showers and the subsequent horror when the gas took effect. SS guards, doctors, and even local civilians confirmed knowledge of these killings. Scientific analysis has found traces of Zyklon B residue in the walls of gas chambers. Photographs and blueprints show the deliberate construction of these facilities for efficient mass killing. The industrialization of murder through gas chambers demonstrates the premeditated and systematic nature of the Holocaust, utterly incompatible with denialist claims. Entire Jewish communities were systematically destroyed across Europe. Before the war, thriving centers of Jewish life existed in Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, and other countries, with synagogues, schools, businesses, and families. By 1945, these communities had vanished. 90% of Poland's Jews were exterminated, and cities like Vilnius, once called the Jerusalem of the North, were left almost entirely without Jews. Denialists cannot explain how entire populations disappeared except by acknowledging genocide. The erasure of cultural, religious, and social structures across the continent is irrefutable evidence that millions were murdered. Gravestones left untended, synagogues reduced to ruins, and abandoned Jewish quarters are silent witnesses to the destruction. The Nazi regime's obsession with bureaucracy and record-keeping is another key source of evidence. The Nazis meticulously documented every aspect of the final solution. From detailed transport lists showing the number of Jews deported from cities to the meticulous logs of camp populations, the paperwork provides undeniable evidence of systematic genocide. Officials created reports summarizing executions by Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that shot Jews in mass graves. Reinhard Heydrich's Wannsee Conference protocol clearly outlines the plan for the final solution. These documents, found after the war, are written in bureaucratic language but reveal chilling efficiency in genocide planning. The very records the Nazis tried to keep hidden prove the enormity of their crimes. Eyewitness accounts from Allied liberators further confirm the Holocaust's reality. When Soviet, American, British, and Canadian forces liberated camps like Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau, soldiers documented what they found with photographs, film reels, and written reports. They discovered thousands of emaciated survivors and tens of thousands of corpses in states of decay. The images shocked the world, providing immediate evidence of crimes on a massive scale. Journalists embedded with the troops reported the scenes, and their stories were widely published, leaving no question about what had occurred. These liberators had no reason to fabricate such accounts. Their shocked testimonies and photographic records remain some of the most powerful evidence available. Census data provides mathematical proof of the Holocaust scale. Pre-war Jewish populations in Europe were recorded in censuses, religious registries, and community records. After the war, comparisons showed millions missing. Poland alone had over 3 million Jews before the war and only a few 100,000 after. Hungary lost nearly 500,000. Across Europe, entire demographic groups vanished. Denialists claim inflated numbers, yet even conservative estimates leave no doubt about the catastrophic scale. Families were not simply missing, they were systematically deported and murdered. The demographic collapse recorded by independent sources, including governments and international organizations, proves the Holocaust's death toll with cold statistical precision. One of the most common denial arguments is the exaggeration of victim numbers. Deniers suggest that far fewer Jews were killed than claimed. However, the combination of Nazi records, census data, survivor testimonies, and demographic studies consistently arrives at the figure of 6 million Jewish deaths. Even if one were to dispute exact figures, the magnitude of destruction, millions of people, remains undeniable. The attempt to reduce the number is not motivated by accuracy but by a desire to diminish Jewish suffering and absolve Nazi crimes. In reality, 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, were murdered in an unprecedented act of state-sponsored genocide. Another frequent claim by deniers is that gas chambers were never used for murder but only for delousing clothing. This lie collapses under the weight of evidence. Survivors described gas chamber killings in detail. Nazi officials admitted to designing and operating them. Scientific examinations of camp ruins found Zyklon B traces specifically in chambers designed for human extermination. Architectural plans prove the intention of construction for mass killing, including ventilation systems to disperse gas. Even SS guards acknowledge their roles in these operations. The suggestion that such facilities were innocuous defies the mountains of evidence and dishonors those who died within their walls. A particularly malicious denial argument is that the Holocaust was fabricated to justify the creation of Israel. This conspiracy theory ignores the timeline. Allied troops liberated camps in 1945, 3 years before Israel's establishment in 1948. At that time, Jewish survivors were destitute, wandering displaced persons camps, and had little influence over international politics. The world saw the atrocities through the eyes of liberators and journalists long before Israel's independence was debated. Suggesting a coordinated fabrication erases the suffering of survivors and ignores the fact that Holocaust recognition was global and immediate, not the invention of a political state decades later. At the heart of Holocaust denial is antisemitism. By dismissing Jewish suffering as fabrication, deniers recycle old prejudices portraying Jews as liars, conspirators, and manipulators. Denial is not an innocent misinterpretation but a deliberate continuation of the hate that fueled Nazi ideology. It blames Jews for inventing their own tragedy and fosters resentment against them in the present. This malicious narrative aims not only to erase history but also to delegitimize Jewish communities worldwide. Recognizing denial as an anti-Semitic weapon is essential to understanding its true purpose: to perpetuate hatred and justify bigotry under the guise of skepticism. The motives behind denial are political and ideological rather than scholarly. Neo-Nazi groups use denial to rehabilitate Hitler and promote fascism. Conspiracy theorists exploit it to argue about supposed global Jewish power. Authoritarian regimes sometimes downplay the Holocaust to weaken Western narratives about human rights. In each case, denial is less about questioning evidence and more about pushing an agenda. By rejecting established history, denial allows extremists to rewrite narratives that serve their ideology. It becomes a tool not of history but of propaganda, spreading lies that manipulate vulnerable minds into embracing hate-filled worldviews. The psychological harm caused by denial cannot be overstated. For survivors who endured starvation, loss of family, torture, and mass death, hearing claims that their suffering never happened is a second act of violence. It reopens wounds and dishonors the memory of their loved ones. For descendants of survivors, denial is a denial of identity and heritage, stripping away acknowledgement of their family's trauma. It transforms a documented genocide into a battleground of lies, inflicting renewed pain on those already scarred. Beyond individuals, denial weakens collective memory and makes society more vulnerable to repeating past atrocities. Holocaust museums and archives around the world preserve truth against denial. Institutions like Yad Vashem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and countless memorials in Europe safeguard millions of documents, photographs, and artifacts. They provide public access to evidence and ensure that the stories of victims and survivors are never forgotten. Digital archives allow global audiences to explore testimonies, Nazi records, and historical analysis. These institutions serve both as education centers and as memorials, ensuring that the Holocaust is remembered accurately. Their existence directly challenges denial by presenting irrefutable evidence curated with scholarly rigor. Modern denial often takes subtler forms than outright rejection. Instead of saying the Holocaust never happened, some claim its scale has been exaggerated, or they equate it with other wartime tragedies to minimize its uniqueness. Online platforms provide fertile ground for these distortions, with social media spreading misinformation rapidly. Revisionists present themselves as skeptics, asking questions, but their goal is to erode trust in established history. By spreading half-truths, cherry-picked data, and pseudoscientific arguments, they attempt to normalize doubt. Recognizing these softer forms of denial is vital, because even small cracks in historical truth can grow into widespread falsehoods. The normalization of denial presents a global danger to historical accountability. If overwhelming evidence can be dismissed as fake, then all atrocities become deniable. This erodes society's ability to confront crimes like Rwanda, Bosnia, or Darfur. It allows perpetrators of future genocides to argue that history will eventually forget or doubt their crimes. By defending the truth of the Holocaust, the world defends the principle that crimes against humanity can be documented, remembered, and prosecuted. Denial undermines justice and weakens human rights protections, making it a threat not just to Jewish history but to global humanity. Education is the most powerful weapon against denial. Teaching the Holocaust accurately in schools helps future generations understand the dangers of hatred, prejudice, and indifference. Survivors' testimonies should be integrated into curricula, films, and literature to give personal dimension to history. When students learn not only facts but also the human cost, they become less vulnerable to denialist rhetoric. As survivors age, new technologies like holographic interviews ensure their voices live on. Education safeguards memory and empowers young people to resist lies, ensuring the Holocaust remains a lesson in vigilance against hatred and genocide. The moral responsibility to defend truth is universal. The Holocaust was not a hoax, it was a genocide that murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others. Denial insults the dead, harms survivors, and threatens truth itself. Humanity cannot allow lies to replace history, because forgetting breeds repetition. To remember is to honor the victims and to protect the future. Combating denial is not merely about Jewish history but about safeguarding human dignity everywhere. By preserving evidence, teaching new generations, and challenging lies, society fulfills its obligation to truth and justice. Memory is resistance, and truth is the weapon against denial.